Everyone wants their mixes to sound super wide and big, but how can you do it in a way that sounds awesome and natural? I'm gonna share with you a few different ways that you can get your production sounding wider and bigger. Something I talk about a lot on this channel is the idea of contrast. And in the conversation about width in a production, you need to understand one of the best ways to get a production sounding wide is to not overuse width. Now I get it, that might sound a little counterintuitive, but hear me out. If you have a production that sounds super wide the entire way through, then the reality is that your listener will essentially become too dull to that fact. So if you want really wide sounding productions that actually sound wide and are noticeably wide to your audience, then you need to pick and choose when and where to use this. And this really comes down to actually thinking through what you want to accomplish in a production before you're actually in the thick of it. Or you should really consider what moments need to be big and what moments need to be all about actually building up to that big moment. So think of it this way. If you give someone something really sweet to eat, like chocolate, and that's all you give them for like a whole day. Now we might all say that sounds great, but the truth is that part of what makes us enjoy eating something is actually contrast. That's why something salty that you eat before chocolate actually makes the chocolate taste that much better. Think of your music that way. If you give your audience something sweet all the way through, in this case we're talking about wideness, then the effect of that wideness kind of gets lost because your audience actually gets too used to it. But if you start something in a more narrow way, and then maybe in the chorus you expand it to sound wider, then this is actually a really good example of that salty food before the chocolate. That narrow part is actually helping to build to the wide part. Now this is obviously not the how to get the wide part, we're gonna get into that in a second, but more understanding the why and when you want it to be wide. So instead of thinking, oh, I just want a super wide mix all the way through, instead identify where it makes the most sense for that to happen. Now, there are gonna be lots of examples of music that sound wide all the way through. So for any time you hear me or others talking about stuff like this, you need to understand that these are not hard and fast rules. This is not a black and white thing. However, these are principles, and principles are meant to help you understand the reasoning behind your decisions. So maybe your song calls for wideness all the way through. Great. But I would say that in most cases, if you want to accentuate the wideness, then a great way of doing that is by not overusing it and picking and choosing where it should go for maximum impact and effect. So if we're talking about like heavy metal, for example, really hard rock, way more likely that that's going to sound wide all the way through because that is more of a staple of that genre. But if we're talking about more mainstream music, even cinematic music, which is a lot of what I'm doing, kind of a blend of cinematic and pop, there's going to be contrast. Great. So now that you understand that really important part, let's actually talk about how. The very first thing is that before you start reaching for stereo widening plugins, make sure you are actually utilizing smart panning first. You'll see a lot of people in their productions doing this whole thing where they're gonna have like panned a little bit this way, a little bit that way, and then maybe a little bit more over here and then a little bit more over there. But if you want wideness, then you need to go for 100% panning. You should be going all of the way. Now, strings are a little bit of a unique scenario. That's what I'm on right now. These are already pre-panned, by the way, in these sample libraries. But this is what's called LCR panning, left, center, right. So basically, things are either gonna go 100% either direction or straight down the middle and nothing in between. Now again, this is not a rule, but this has been used for literally decades as a very common practice to get wider sounding production. So I'm not saying don't ever use 25% panning. We're talking about specifically if we're talking about wide stuff. That should go all the way. Somehow panning gets overlooked a lot of the time. But before we even talk about panning, we really need to talk about making sure you are producing in a way that will actually help make panning work. Because panning is not complicated. I'm just gonna say that, it's not complicated. But here's the thing. If you are producing, you have, one guitar part and then one keyboard part and then one other element, then panning is oftentimes going to sound lopsided. So when you really want that wide sounding production, you should really aim to have balance in pairs. In other words, if I'm working on something with big guitars, then I'm going to make sure that if I have a rhythm guitar part, that I actually double that part. So again, I'm working in pairs. There's going to be two of that guitar part. Now I'm either going to double track them, so I have the exact same part done twice. That's going to help me get a really nice and wide effect, or I'm gonna record two separate parts that are close but not the same. It might have some rhythmic variation or perhaps a different voicing. So maybe something like a capo on one and no capo on the other, or power chords that are low and then power chords that are high on the other. This way, when I pan one guitar, all the way over to the right, I'm not leaving that left side empty because we don't have another guitar to go there. Because if you pan a guitar all the way over here and then a piano all the way over here, those sounds are sonically so different that that does not actually help you get that wide sounding guitar sound. If you only have one one guitar part, then it's gonna sound lopsided because it's lacking something on the other side to counterbalance it. So if we think about panning, if we put something all the way over the right, it's gonna start kind of making the right side feel heavier than the left side, okay? And you might be wondering about something like piano. Well, piano is a bit different because more often than not, you're gonna have piano that's recorded in stereo. In other words, two microphones where one's going to the right and one's going to the left. That means that there's already gonna be some wideness to it. So if you record piano live, then I recommend recording in stereo because you're automatically gonna get that wide effect. But just keep in mind that the further you actually spread the mics away from each other, the wider it will sound. But if you're like me and you're primarily using sound libraries, a lot of libraries are gonna have a knob that controls the stereo image of the piano. I very often use this to widen out that piano sound. So in here, for example, this is Noir. If I go to the effects right in here, you can see stereo image. If we turn this off, this is what it sounds like. But if I turn this on, if you're wearing headphones, you'll be able to hear this a lot better. It automatically kind of widen that sound off. I put it all the way to 200%. That's a little aggressive, that's a little bit too much, but if you really want that sound, you can certainly do that. For me, I'm gonna kind of go somewhere in the middle because I don't really want my piano to sound ridiculously wide in this case. In the case of the piano, you're not gonna really be double tracking like you would do with the guitar example, unless you are recording in mono with one mic. So in terms of panning, the main idea here is that panning is the most natural way to get something sounding wide. And if you really want those wide guitars to be nice and wide guitars, it's best to produce them in pairs to have the ability to pan the way that I've already explained here. Now, the second way of getting something nice and wide is realizing that a lot of the wideness you hear in modern music comes from the vocals. Now, vocal production is one of the most important aspects in getting something sounding super wide. And in fact, if you have an ultra wide sounding instrumental, it can actually make it harder to have really wide sounding vocals because now everything is spread out. And again, it kind of takes away from what you want. So it's kind of like what I said earlier about thinking about the reasoning behind the why you do something. If you were to look at some of my productions, you'll notice that I have a lot of stuff that's just not panned at all because I know that my vocals will be. And this means that the width of my track comes heavily from the vocal production and less from the instrumental. In fact, looking at this track right here, we actually haven't tracked vocals yet. But you can see piano's not panned. I have this muted piano, it's not panned. These hammer parts here, it's kind of a pad-esque thing. It's not panned. No panning, no panning, no panning. So there's a lot of stuff in here. In fact, most of the stuff is not panned. All of the strings and brass, by the way, is already pre-panned just because the sound libraries already handle some of that. But apart from that, nothing is panned yet. And a lot of the reason is because I actually don't really need it on this particular track to give me that sound. We're gonna actually talk about how I make this track sounding wide here in just a second. But one of the best ways I'm gonna make this track sounding wide is by producing the vocals to be very big and very wide. Now I wanna be really clear, I'm not saying that I don't pan at all in the instrumental. In fact, once we actually get to the mix session, I might pan some of this stuff, but to be completely honest, even just looking at this right now, I kind of doubt it. But I most certainly do panning in most of these productions. So I'm not talking about not panning at all. So it's not like an all or nothing type thing. If I'm doing something like rock with lots of guitars, there's definitely gonna be a lot of panning going on. But I'm talking about not going crazy, not panning everything. A lot of the elements will be centered. And that's kind of another point, is that a lot of times people think they want it wide, so they're gonna pan everything. That's really bad. You wanna make sure that there's still a lot of stuff in the center. And basically all I'm saying with this is I wanna keep it so that the instrumental is gonna leave some space in the stereo field to place those vocals. Now, pretty much all the music I'm working on has at least vocal doubles happening. And in most cases, it's doubles, harmonies, and maybe even octaves to help with a lot of vocal depth. So what I do when I'm producing vocals is I track out the lead vocal, I keep it centered. Once we finish tracking, I'm gonna comp that vocal so we know what takes we're using, and then we're gonna take care of the doubles. So I'm gonna create 2 new tracks, okay? I'm gonna pan one to the left and one to the right. We're gonna record those parts to be performed as closely to the lead as possible, and then I do this again with harmonies and with octaves if the song calls for it. Not every song calls for it. So altogether, I might have a song with 5 to 8 tracks of vocals or more in one part of the song. And another little side note here, I'm almost never doing it that way for the entire song. Remember what we talked about earlier is contrast, picking and choosing where those parts need to go. So in most cases, and on this track it's gonna be this way, the verse is gonna have one vocal. That's it. No doubles, no harmonies, nothing. But once we get to that chorus, boom, all of a sudden that vocal production is gonna really get big, really get wide, so that way now the listener is like, whoa, this is really big. And to get this sounding really great, you really need to make sure that that lead vocal is dead center all the way, and then the other parts are panned hard either direction. Now, some songs might call for even more than this. Like, instead of double tracking, you might actually do quadruple tracking. I don't do this as often, but when you start doing more than just doubles, this is where panning can go beyond just going 100% right, 100% left. That's where you might actually want to do some experimenting with one part being 100%, the other part being 50%. So you're gonna have 4 doubles. You're gonna have 2 on the right, 2 on the left, one's 100%, and then one's 50% on each of those doubles. And that's really just gonna help separate those parts out from each other so there's nice distinction from them. But either way, vocal production is actually where a massive amount of that width is gonna be coming from in a lot of productions. So before you start reaching for stereo field plugins or even painting the crap out of all your instrumentals, see if you can accomplish this with vocal production more heavily. And that leads us to, yes, stereo widening plugins. I'm gonna show you some examples here in a second. Now, to be honest with you, I really think that the best way to approach this is to use these plugins when it's on something that you would not double track. Now, the reason is because double tracking is pretty much always gonna be the best option, but it's also not gonna be the most applicable option in some cases. So for example, if I have a synth bass part, I'm not likely gonna double that unless I plan on really modifying the sound enough to where they're different enough to make that work, if that makes sense. I have done that, but in most cases, I will use stereo widening plugins. So in the case of a synth bass, if I wanna add additional wideness from that, then I'm gonna use some stereo widening. Now, the great thing is that a lot of these synth instruments are gonna have tools built right into them, which will usually sound the best because they are native to that instrument. Now, this isn't a synth bass part. This is kind of an ostinato part. We'll look at a synth bass part in just a second. This is the Super 8 synth from Native Instruments. Let's listen. That's pretty much what it's doing. It's this nice little effect going on. But if we look down at the bottom here on effects, it actually has a chorus effect. Now, this is not exactly a stereo widening effect, but a chorus effect because it's going to do more than just widen the sound. But by turning this on, it is going to widen the sound. It's going to add some other coloration as well, but just listen to the difference here. I'm going to turn it off again and I'll turn it on. Off, on. So even though this is not necessarily a stereo widening plugin specifically, chorus effects are going to make your sounds wider. Let's take a look at another example that is actually like an actual bass part. We've got this subby dirty bass here. Cool. Now, this is already a wide sounding bass. Like if you just listen to this, especially if you're wearing headphones or listening on monitors, you can tell this already has some nice width on it. Right? It's not like dead center. It's not narrow at all. But if we listen to the context of the whole track, listen. That's kind of the start of this whole track. I really want to make sure that this part is really wide. I want this to sound really wide at the beginning. So what I did here is I used a plugin called Thermal by Output. Now granted, this is a distortion plugin. This is not actually a dedicated stereo widening plugin. However, I will say this is probably the best stereo widening plugin that I've used that has a width element in it. And it is right in here. So you have to go into the effects here, width, turn that on, and this is going to adjust how wide it goes. So if you have all the way, that's going to go all the way to the sides, okay? If this is all the way in the center. And then width is going to kind of almost like, where is it actually placed in terms of closeness to yourself, or how far away does it sound? So if we have this width off, let's listen again. All right, let's turn the width on now. Woo! All right, now let's actually listen in the context of the whole track. So width off. All right, let's actually put the width on. It helps actually kind of separate out that bass part from everything else, which helps kind of bring some clarity to that sound. So again, I'm kind of thinking about, why do I even want this in the first place? Do I just want it because it's like cool and it sounds wider and that sounds awesome? No, it's more about, I actually want that to have a little bit more clarity and a little bit more definition from everything else. And one final thing we could look at is another example like this. It's kind of a pad-esque element. Now this is something that I'm not gonna double track this, right? Like this is not something that we would actually double track. Same thing with that subby dirty bass that we use. That's not something we're gonna double track. But if we want it to sound wider, this is where using stereo widening plugins would be great. I'm also not gonna pan this, right? Because if I just pan, it's gonna sound weird. We don't wanna do that. So in this case, I could do the exact same thing. It's gonna go here to output and add width. And let's just go ahead and see how this sounds. Off, and then on. And this is one of the more natural sounding stereo widening plugins in my opinion. The Logic Pro one, I just don't think it sounds super great. So if we listen to the context here now. Off. That actually is adding a lot of volume, so I'm gonna make sure we bring down the volume on this. It's off. It's really subtle in this particular case, but I'm just using this as an example. I'm not actually gonna do this in this particular track. This is just an example of something where I would actually go ahead and use a stereo plugin because again, it's not something I'm gonna double, it's not something I'm gonna pan, and that's where you would actually then go to using stereo widening plugins. Now, the thing that you need to be careful with when it comes to these types of plugins is that they can oftentimes add artifacts. They can sound really unnatural, which is again, why I'm talking about using them in moderation. I usually try to focus on just making my productions wider. With some of the options that we've already talked about, I just did want to give you some examples of when I would actually use these stereo plugins basically. But this is usually just not the main thing I'm gonna go for. By the way, I never use these on vocals, I never use them on guitars, because I just know that I can get way better results by simply producing those to have more width instead of mixing them to have more width. I'm a big believer in producing what you want and not relying so heavily on mixing hacks to get what you want. Now, if you wanna see how I go about getting productions that sound way more interesting to your audience by utilizing arrangement and not having to rely so heavily on mixing tricks and hacks to get there, you're gonna wanna watch this video right here next. I'll see you there.